Quote, Hindu culture and the caste system, writes Gail Omvedt in her EPW article on Jotirao Phule in 1971, rested upon Brahmanism. Hence, Phule, who aimed for the complete destruction of caste, superstition, and inequality within Indian tradition, linked his thought with a movement of opposition to the Brahmin elite. End quote. On Phule's birth anniversary, we'll discuss his writing on caste, class, and gender relations in South Asia, and importantly, the methods he used to counter Brahmanism and patriarchy in collaboration with his co-traveler and wife, Savitribai Phule. I'm your host Abhishek, and today on a special episode of Research Radio, Tejas Harad will join us to discuss his engagement and research primarily on Jotirao Phule. Tejas has worked at EPW since 2013 as a copy editor and regularly contributes to multiple news publications in his individual capacity. We'll also partially focus on Savitribai Phule, but this episode does not cover the depth of her work. Last year, Tejas started a bilingual journal called the Satyashodhak that seeks to make the Satyashodhak archive more accessible to people, but the portal's focus is not limited to that, in his own words. I've linked a few articles that EPW has published on the Phules, as well as links to 2 articles that Tejas has authored outside EPW. Thank you so much for joining us, Tejas.
Thank you for having me.
So, the Phules are seen as inspirational because they did not stick to writing on inequality, but took path-breaking steps to change the scenario, and faced multiple consequences for doing so. Could we discuss their views on the relationship between theory and practice, particularly in terms of Jyotirao's use of language and the medium of communication that he employed?
Fules were primarily doers. They started a school in 1848 when Jotirao was, I think, about 21 and Savitribai was 17. And that was like their first initiative, which was before they wrote anything. So they started, and later on also, whenever Jotirao wrote, it was to supplement his, activities. So he did not want to contribute to scholarly discussions or to give a new theory. Like he did want to give a new theory, but his primary focus was always how that will aid his efforts, that he's pushing for through other on ground activities. For example, he founded Satyashodhak Samaj in 1873. So that was in September, and his Gulumgiri was published in June that year. So I sometimes feel that there is some connection, between publishing Gulumgiri and then founding Satyashodhak Samaj, because the principles that were put out at the foundation of Satyashodhak Samaj, you can see their basis in Gulumgiri. So so he was using his writing for the work that he was doing, and that is why his writing was polemical. We cannot ignore or dismiss that fact. His writing was polemical. He wanted to give new energy to lower caste non-Brahmin population, and keeping that in mind, he wrote what he wrote. And that is why you also find some sort of repetition in all his writings. The themes that he's approaching, that he's engaging with, he tackles similar themes in all the writings that he has done. Like Gulumgiri, he engages with the Brahmin supremacism. That topic again comes up in Cultivators Whipcord, or in Marathi, Shetkaracha Asud, and his last book, Sarvajanik Satya Dharma Pustak. So in that also he again goes back to that theme. So you find a similarity in that way. But that is because he was writing these texts in different years, in different decades sometimes. But he wanted people to understand what Brahminism is doing to lower castes, how it is affecting them, and how one can rise and revolt against it. So he that was his primary focus, how he can energize people and make them rebel against the system.
Right, right. And actually, can we go maybe focus in on one of the works? Maybe Gulumgiri would be a good one to focus in on, and to understand how some of his, how he was able to, hone on this theory. I mean, the connection between theory and practice, and his use of language, and the way that he communicated this. So, if we can focus on maybe just one of his works.
Yeah, so Gulumgiri, he has done three major texts, and the first one and the most popular one also is Gulumgiri that he wrote in 1873. And in that he engages with Puranic mythology mainly. He discusses the 10 avatar theory that is very popular among Hindus. That even now everybody knows about it, and everybody, like, it pops up in different contexts. And he would have thought that because everybody knows this, it will be good to engage with these myths, and that is what he does in Gulumgiri. So he might have done that because people know all these myths and they take them for granted. They never challenge them or scrutinize them, and that probably is the reason why Brahmin supremacy also is not challenged by people. They take the authority of Brahmins for granted. So in Gulamgiri, first few chapters, he engages with each myth, each avatar, in each chapter. He sort of takes the myth at face value and applies taste of rationality, logic, and science. I don't think that he actually thought that those myths were history. Seeing the kind of person that Phule was and how rational he was and how well read he was, etc. I do not think that he actually believed that that was history, but he probably thought that even if he were to accept that as history, he could still challenge Brahminism through that, and he actually could like turn that on its head. Because like every people, Brahmins especially, but everybody would like think that this is what is like history. This is what has happened in ancient times. Nobody really questioned that, and I feel that when I'm reading it, he's sarcastic also, and it feels like he's deriving a lot of pleasure by poking holes at the logic of it. So, to give one example, he says that people say that we had four varnas through different parts of Brahma's body. From mouth came the Brahmin, and from shoulder Kshatriya, and from thighs the Vaishya, and from the feet Shudra. We know that theory, right? And Phule says that how is that logically possible? Like, did like Brahma had four vaginas? Did he like menstruate 4 times a month? So you can see the kind of like fun he's having at those bits.
Right, right. So let's zoom out a bit to understand this some more because despite their contributions, both Jotirao and Savitribai Phule have not received adequate scholarly and literary attention, especially in English speaking contexts. Let's discuss what made you interested in researching about their writing and organizing efforts.
Started really, I think, in the 1960s and 70s when Dhananjay Keer wrote his biography of Jotirao Phule, and then Maharashtra government published collected volume of Phule's writings. There was a lot of sporadic writing on Jotirao and Savitribai till then, but there wasn't an organized effort to republish his writings or critically analyze his work or his writings. So that happened in the Marathi literary sphere or the social movement space around 1960s, 70s, and then 1990 was the centenary of Phule. That is when the first English translation of Phule's writings appeared, and that also was because of the Maharashtra government. So there has been that neglect in Marathi cultural sphere, social sphere, as well as in English, more so in English. The interest in English academia about Fule's, it is still like at a very nascent stage. There have been few works that have looked at Jotirao Phule, Savitribai Phule, and Satyashodhak Samaj. Like notable ones are Gail Omvedt, who also wrote one paper, very early in 1970s for EPW. So that was sort of the first systematic analysis of Satyashodhak Samaj and post Phule non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra. Then in 1980s, we had Rosalind O'Hanlon's book, which looked at the ideas that shaped Jotirao Phule. And then, like, early 2000s, Leftward published a translation of Jyotirao's writings. So other than that, very few works on Fule's. We don't have much. There are articles and research papers, but the kind of attention that other social reformers from other caste backgrounds and other leaders have attracted, that Fule's haven't got yet. And that was sort of one reason why I also wanted to work on it, Like Phule is a very well-known figure in Maharashtra. We learn about both Savitribai and Jyotiba in our textbooks in Maharashtra, and in the cultural, social, in the anti-caste movement. Everybody knows about them, but people know the name, but not much beyond that. Like we don't, people don't know their real contribution. They will know that they set up schools, but beyond that, lay public will not know much. So there is that lacuna in Marathi as well, and in English, because English sort of becomes this link language for everybody in India, because there is no much work on Fule's in English. People outside Maharashtra don't know about him at all. At the most they will know the name, but not anything else. And that is why I was looking at like what kind of work has been done on them in English, and I realized that even the books about him that are published in English, they are out of print. There were a lot of people who would ask me like, what should I read about Fule's, how do I go about finding it, where do I find it? And like people who can't access libraries, people who are not in academic institutions, they would like look for PDFs and ebooks, etc., or cheap print copies. But because that was not available in English, I thought that it would be good idea to look at the archive which is out of copyright, and sort of do something so that those things become available for people who read and access stuff in English.
Right. I think that's also quite counter to intuitive because Jotirao Phule at least was very deliberate about trying to create a broad-based movement. So even the his approach of writing, his use of language, as a lot of scholars have written, the fact that he published small pamphlets, which I hope that we'll get to later during the podcast. But he this was kind of contrary to his attempts and his efforts to be have a mass reach, right?
Yes, that is true. He made sure that he wrote in Marathi. We have to understand that in 19th century, very few people from non-Brahmin background were educated, were literate. And Phule was writing for this newly educated public. Like his audience was never the Brahmins. He sometimes petitioned the British government, and he wrote in English for that purpose. So he could like read write in English, and he used to read a lot of the English literature. But he wrote in simple Marathi dialect, which he got criticized for also by upper caste Marathi scholars or writers or activists. But I think it was deliberate on his part to do that, because his audience was what he called Shudras and Atishudras, and there is a possibility that he knew that not many people could read what he was writing, but there might be a public which was listening to these things, like somebody else will read it out stuff to them. And that could be a reason why he wrote what he wrote in a dialogue form. Most of his writings are in a dialogue form. Gulumgiri, for example, which is his like most famous text, it is in a dialogue form. His last book, that also is in dialogue form. So all of these things that he was doing, the kind of language that he was using, the kind of metaphors that he was using, the form that he was using, it must have been deliberate on his part.
Yes, yes, yes. And could we transition to discussing how Jyotirao Phule's thinking on British colonial power evolved over time?
I think it is in Gulumgiri only, if I'm not wrong, that he says that he actually had joined hands with Brahmin revolutionaries in overthrowing the colonial powers. And that was like, he sort of says that I was this like heady youth, where I had these misguided ideas and I wanted to overthrow the British Raj, or it probably wasn't, because 1857 mutiny had not happened then. But like he wanted to like overthrow the colonial power, and then when he's writing this, probably in the 1870s, he says that that was really foolish on my part. And he also chastises Vasudev Balwant Phadke, who was this Brahmin revolutionary who had gathered Ramoshis especially as his sort of foot soldiers to fight the British. And he says that these people are getting killed because of this false bravado of Phadke. So he's very derisive of Phadke. So apart from that, what he calls his heady youth, he did not challenge the British power itself. He just wanted to negotiate with it. Some people, take an issue with that. They say that it was wrong on Fule's part to put faith in the British power, but I am not sure about that because he was obviously comparing British Raj with what existed before that, and what Fule had seen in Pune, or like his earlier generation, was the Peshwa Raj, right? And he knew that even if British Raj is overthrown in 19th century, there is no chance that the power will go to Shudra Ati Shudras. It will be captured by the Brahmins, right? So therefore, he did not really want to work towards that, like work towards overthrowing the British Raj, and that idea also was very nascent at that stage because we know that the Indian National Congress itself was founded in 1880s, which was the last decade of Fule's life. So like this idea that British Raj is evil and needs to be thrown, etc. That wasn't as widespread as it was in early 20th century. So we need to like remember all of these contexts before we criticize Fule. But like coming back to your question, how he looked at the colonial the rulers. So he wanted a lot of state intervention in lot of things because he believed that the system will not change on its own. Like because all of the organizations except like most of the organizations except Satyashodhak Samaj were Brahmin dominated, and that is why he did not actually join any of them. Like even Paramham Sabha, which was relatively much more progressive than others like Pratna Samaj or Brahmo Samaj, then Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. So all of these were all Brahmin dominated. He did not join any of them. So he did not really believe that the change can entirely happen due to the non-state social reform activities.
Right, right. And what were his views about education and the role of state intervention in agriculture?
If we come to like if we talk about education, which was like the thing that he worked the most on and was closest to his heart, he wanted universal free education. He was one of the very few people from that era who advocated for universal free education. That idea itself was new, not just for India, but I guess for entire world. Then he wanted, he believed that Brahmin teachers don't teach non-Brahmins sincerely, and they also teach them religious dogma. And therefore, he said that British rulers need to train Shudra, Ati Shudra teachers, and they should teach their own children. So in agriculture also he wanted state intervention. He was for that kind of policy framing, and but he did not believe in the egalitarianism or whatever of the British Raj. It wasn't that because he criticizes British a lot, especially in Cultivators Whipcord. He says that I don't know if he blames them of corruption, but he does say that the Brahmin bureaucrats are corrupt and British don't do anything about it, and he chastises for them for that. He also criticizes them for like collecting taxes from peasantry but not doing anything for agricultural reforms. So he does criticize British government a lot, and that also could be a reason why Narayan Lokhande did not publish the entire of the book. So Cultivators Whipcord was published, serially. It has 4 or 5 parts, and Lokhande, who ran Dinbandhu then, he published the first 2 parts, but then he refused to publish the later parts, saying that he might attract suit of libel, and that is because Phule was criticizing the government without any inhibitions. It's just that he did not want to overthrow the power. So that was one thing that was one thing that was constant. That he did not want change of rule, but he did criticize their functioning a lot on a lot of occasions.
Mhm, mhm. I think that also makes sense in terms of how he framed the primary conflict as between Shudra Ati Shudras and Brahmins rather than in terms of a class or another kind of analysis of the fragmented nature of society. Yeah. So I think this brings us nicely to the question about how the Fules actually brought together fragmented social groups under the banner of Shudra Ati Shudras. And, I was particularly interested in knowing about how they, quote, drew on existing symbols from Maharashtra's warrior and agricultural traditions, end quote, as Rosalind O'Hannon has identified.
Yes, so they wanted to move away from Brahmanical system, but at the same time, Phule tried to give an alternative as much as possible. So when somebody became a member of their organization, they were supposed to do something called as picking up tali. So tali is like this very specific thing that I don't know if it exists anymore, but it's some sort of combination of some ingredients. I think turmeric and something else that I'm not entirely sure of. So which was being drawn directly from Shudra, Ati Shudra, social sphere. And then Phule also speaks a lot about deities like Khandoba, Masoba, which are non-Brahmin deities, local deities, as opposed to your Brahminical gods like Vishnu. Like we already saw that he criticized those gods a lot in his book Gulumgiri, right? But at the same time, he props up these non-Brahmin deities, which are already popular among the people. But he brings them forth as a challenge to Brahminical orthodoxy system and gods, and he does that in cultural sphere. And one major example of that is the lot of the religious functions events that take place in people's lives from birth to their death, right? Our society has a lot of these ceremonies that take place. For example, wedding. So he and his colleagues, did not want Brahmins' presence in these ceremonies, and that presence is signified by the Brahmin priest primarily, right? So the first thing that they took up after founding their organization was not inviting Brahmin priests to all these ceremonies, and we see that these members of the organization, they start performing all these ceremonies without Brahmin priest and without Brahminical rituals. The most famous is the Satyashodhak marriage, for example. So in that there is no Brahmin priest, but Phule also gave like a proper description how that marriage should be conducted.
Are there one or two things you can share?
Like specific examples.
Yeah, like what he suggested.
So in the marriage ceremony, there will not be Brahmin priest, for example, and along with that, there will not be what we Marathi people called as Mangalashtake. So Mangalashtake are these stanzas, verses, which are recited by the Brahmin priest when the actual ceremony is going on, and these verses are religious in nature. They sort of like pay homage to a lot of gods, and they also are partly in Sanskrit, which people don't understand. So as an alternative, Phule he composed stanzas which were in Marathi and which actually were to be recited by the bridegroom and bride themselves. So there was no third party which would recite these verses, but the pair themselves. And even the content of these verses was very interesting. Like I'll give one example. Like the bride says that women suffer a lot in the current society. They are treated as second class citizens, and therefore I ask you to fight for women's rights. And then the bridegroom replies that yes, that is true, and I'll indeed fight for women's right as much as I can. So you can see the kind of change that Phule is bringing to like something like a wedding, where everything is so religious, so Brahminical, and everything happens mechanically. Like there are a lot of these rituals which people perform because they're supposed to perform, and nobody pays attention to anything that is being done or said, all the mantras and everything, right? But here, like Phule is asking the bride and bridegroom themselves to take control, and they themselves will decide, and they like the kind of stuff that they're saying is also so meaningful and so ahead of its time. Actually, like even the feminist movement in Western countries in Europe was at a very early stage then, right? And in that era, Phule is talking about women's rights and equality. So you can see how revolutionary it was.
Yes, yes, and as we discussed, Jotirao Phule sought to bring together the oppressed instead of focusing on the differences among them. However, Jotirao Phule has also been critiqued for not being attentive and considering the differences in power among women and farm workers in particular. What do you make of this criticism?
What a person does not do or does not write about, that list will always be very long. So and Fulle like did talk about agriculture a lot, but as you say, he did not really touch upon the differences as much. That could be because his primary theme, as we discussed, was the dialectic between Brahmins and Shudras, Atishudras. So that was the primary lens that he was, looking at society through, and that comes across in almost all his works. And that could be a reason why he sort of overlooked, this internal differentiation among the peasantry. But I feel that whenever he writes about agriculture, about peasants, like I feel that what he has in mind is like primarily the smallholders and marginal farmers. He would not really care much about the zamindars and the big landholders. Even though he did not speak about them specifically, he did talk about the Maratha rulers, or so-called Maratha confederacy rulers, who were ruling in princely states. So you had Holkars, Sindhiyads, Gaikwads, etc. He was close to Gaikwads, but he did criticize the other rulers for not doing anything for lower castes. And he does, criticize them a lot for just being interested in spending their wealth on really foolish things, and just like enjoying themselves and not doing anything for people. And he also takes objection to people who call themselves Marathas and take pride in being a Maratha, and sort of trying to show that they're equal to Brahmin, sort of like what MS Srinivas calls Sanskritization. So there are those elements where you see that he does not really like the aristocracy among the Shudras especially.
Okay, I guess transitioning to the role that Jotirao Phule felt that religion should have, GB Deshpande has written that, quote, Jotirao Phule was not interested in tinkering with this or that aspect of the Brahminical structure to make it a little more humane. He argued for its complete rejection. And Deshpande, end quote. Deshpande also adds that Jyotira wanted to, quote, dethrone the Brahmin from his preeminent position of being the go between God and man, end quote. So I wanted to know more about Phule's perspective on the role that religion should have in this social transformation.
He did want a complete break from Brahminism, and you see that in the way he attacks Brahminical mythology, Puranic narratives in Gulumgiri. He does not want anything to do with it at all. He completely rejects it. But he wasn't a religious person, even though he spoke a lot about it. In his mind, God was somebody who created the world. He calls God Nirmik, which is a Marathi term which I think best can be translated as creator. So he looked at God as creator, but I think that that is where God's role ends. Like he created the universe, and then everything that happens later on is like people are responsible for it. So he limited the role of God to only that, but he did not want to reject the cultural aspects of people's lives completely. Like therefore, like we saw that he tries to appropriate the Shudra Shudra symbols and deities and also narratives. Like the most famous is King Bali. That myth is very popular among uh, non-Brahmins in certain regions, and he gives a lot of importance to that. He also like the weddings also, he rejects Brahmin priest, but he wants people to continue certain rituals that are performed in the wedding, in Sudati Shudra families. So there is like that strain of what we can call secularism in Fule's thinking.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. And we started talking about this already, but if we can unpack one conflict, there were several, but among members of the Satyashodhak Samaj or other colleagues of Jyoti Rao, and maybe what it tells us about the fissures or differences within the anti-caste movement today.
So as I said, like Fule was much ahead of his times. He was truly radical, a revolutionary figure, and his colleagues did not always match up to his vision, which we can see when we look at what sometimes is called women's question. So there were two women who were criticized around the same time in early 1880s, Pandita Ramabai and Tarabai Shinde. Ramabai had converted to Christianity, and for that she was criticized by not just Brahmin Orthodox people but also the liberals. And Tarabai Shinde, was criticized for writing this book called Stri Purush Tulna, which looked at the relations between men and women. And there were some people in Satyashodhak Samaj also who had taken objection to Tarabai Shinde's text. And Phule writes mentions that, and criticizes those people for criticizing Shinde and Pandita Ramabai. So he takes a very strong position, and he also like resorts to sort of very sarcastic jibes at people who are criticizing these two women. So there were some of these instances where you can see, that Phule's colleagues did not always match up to his radicalism. One we mentioned earlier, when he was writing Cultivators of Hipcard, Lokhande did not publish the third and fourth part of that book because he thought it was like a bit too radical. So there were like these differences. I don't know how those map out in the current scenario, but like there are always like internal differences in all movements which people have to accept as something that is always going to happen and work around it. But like like Phule's movement, because Phule was from Brahmanical point of view, is a Shudra background, and there wasn't an autonomous Dalit movement that time, which came later with Ambedkar. Around that time, all the non-Brahmin leaders joined Congress, and that sort of created a gap between Ambedkar's movement and the Shudra leadership. And we sort of see that the consequences of that in the current movement as well. But it's like a very complex topic that we can't really cover here.
Right. And the last question that I'd like to leave you with is what are some of the unanswered questions that you hope to investigate with your future scholarship and that changes the present scenario where there's a dearth of material and engagement with Phule's scholarship and actions?
So I hope that I managed to bring out stuff which hasn't been into English, which is like there's a lot of work that is happening on Phule in Marathi right now, and like my primary goal is to sort of make that accessible to English readers as well. And as we discussed, the writings on Phule's in English is not much, and there is like a very urgent need to have something that that is accessible and gives even like a general reader good idea of who the Phules were, why they're important, and why we should engage with them.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us on Research Radio, Tejas. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you for having me, Abhishek.
Thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this special episode. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. We have an exciting series coming up for you starting this Wednesday to mark Dr. Ambedkar's birth anniversary and Dalit History Month. As always, Research Radio is accessible on all major streaming platforms, and we'd love to get your feedback via any of EPW's social media handles. I'll see you soon.